I was standing in the middle of the office floor when my son-in-law looked straight at me and said, "You don't belong here anymore." His voice calm like he had already won, like everything had already been decided, and around us the room went quiet. Not the kind of silence that comes from respect, but the kind that comes from people waiting to see how far something will go before it breaks. I could feel their eyes on me, the younger staff pretending to type, the older ones not even hiding it. Some of them had known me for years. Some of them had sat across from me in meetings back when this place was just an idea on paper. But now none of that seemed to matter, because in that moment, I was just an old man standing where I wasn't supposed to be, and he knew it, or at least he thought he did. He adjusted his suit like he was straightening the room itself, like he owned the air in it. "Security will escort you out if needed," he added, not loud, not aggressive, just certain, like he was doing me a favor, like this was mercy and not humiliation. And right there, before I move on, I want you to tell me something. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And if you've ever seen someone get disrespected like this, or maybe it happened to you, then hit subscribe, because stories like this only get worse before they get better. And I promise you, this one doesn't end the way they think it will. My daughter was standing just a few feet behind him, not saying a word, not even looking at me directly. She used to run into my arms when she was small. Used to ask me if I'd always be there, and I always said yes without hesitation. Now she just stood there quiet, letting her husband erase me from a place I built with my own hands. And I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind anyone in that room of who I was or what I had done. I just looked at him for a second longer than he expected. Then I gave a small nod, like I understood, like I accepted it. And that seemed to satisfy him more than anything else. Like my silence was proof that he had been right all along, that I had nothing left to stand on. I turned and started walking toward the exit, each step steady, not rushed, not slow, just enough to let them all see that I wasn't being dragged out. I was leaving on my own, and as I passed the glass wall, I caught my reflection for a brief second. An old man in a simple coat. No badge, no title, no place here anymore, at least that's what it looked like. And behind that reflection, I could still see him standing there. Already talking to someone else, already moving on, like I had never mattered. And maybe that was the moment everything finally became clear, not what he had done, not what my daughter had allowed, but how far they were willing to go, because you don't say something like that unless you're absolutely sure the person in front of you has no power left. And that was his mistake. The one thing he didn't know, the one thing I had never told him, not when he first joined, not when he started climbing, not even when he sat in the chair that used to be mine. He believed the title made him the owner. He believed control meant ownership. And I let him believe that for a long time, longer than I probably should have. But sometimes the only way to see how someone truly is to step back and give them just enough space to show you what they'll do when they think no one can stop them. And now I had seen enough, so I walked out of that building without looking back. Not because I had nothing left inside, but because I knew exactly what was waiting next. And that moment when he told me I didn't belong, that wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something he never saw coming. I didn't go home right away. After I left that building, I walked past the parking lot and kept going until the noise of the street started to replace the silence in my head. And it gave me time to think, not about what had just happened, but about how it had been building for years, because nothing like that happens in a single moment. It grows quietly in small changes, in the way people look at you, in the way they stop asking for your opinion, in the way your voice slowly becomes something they can ignore. And I had seen all of it long before. That day, I just chose not to stop it. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 68 years old. And most people who see me now would never guess that I was the one who started that company from a small rented office with a desk that wobbled every time I leaned on it. I built it from nothing. No investors, no safety net. just long nights, bad coffee, and the kind of pressure that makes or breaks you, and for years it felt like everything I did was for my family, especially for my daughter. She was the reason I kept going when things almost fell apart. The reason I believed that one day all of it would mean something more than just money. I wanted to give her something stable, something she would never have to fight for the way I did. And for a long time I thought I had done exactly that. After my wife passed away, the house felt too quiet, and the company became the only place where I still felt useful, so I stayed involved longer than I probably should have. But as the years went on, I started stepping back. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to see what would happen. If I wasn't always there, making every decision, I moved my name away from the front. I stopped. Instead attending every meeting, I let other people take the credit, and eventually I handed over the role of CEO to someone I believed I could trust, someone who at the time seemed ambitious, but respectful. Someone who understood what the company stood for. Or at least that's what I thought back then. And when my daughter introduced me to the man she wanted to marry, I remember watching him closely. Not because I didn't like him, but because I had spent my whole life learning how to read people, and something about him felt too polished, too calculated, like he knew exactly what to say in every situation. He was confident without hesitation, charming without effort, and people like that usually want more than they admit. But my daughter looked at him like he was everything she had been waiting for, and I didn't want to be the kind of father who stood in the way of her happiness. So I welcomed him into the family, I gave him opportunities, I let him see parts of the business most people never got access to, and over time he proved himself, at least on the surface. Results were good, numbers were strong, and when the position of CEO opened up, he was the one everyone pointed to, including my daughter. She told me it was time for a new generation to lead. She said the company needed someone who understood the future and not the past. And I remember nodding like I agreed, even though something in me hesitated just for a second before I pushed it aside because I trusted her. And in some way, I wanted to believe that maybe I had done my job well enough that I could finally step back and let someone else carry the weight. What I didn't realize was that stepping back doesn't just create space for growth. Sometimes it creates space for people to rewrite the story in a way that leaves you out of it completely. And by the time I started noticing the changes, it was already too late. Not because I had lost control, but because I had allowed them to think that I had, and that belief was what gave him the confidence to stand in front of me that morning and say I didn't belong there anymore. It didn't happen all at once. The distance between me and my daughter grew in ways that were easy to ignore. At first, she stopped calling as often. Then when she did, the conversations felt shorter, like she already had somewhere else to be, even when she didn't. She used to ask for my opinion about everything, from small decisions to things that actually mattered. And then slowly she stopped asking and started informing me instead, telling me what had already been decided, as if I was just someone who needed to be updated rather than someone who had a say. And I remember the first time she said it in a way that didn't feel like her. She laughed lightly and said, "You wouldn't really understand how things work now, Dad. Things are different." And I smiled, like it didn't bother me, like I was proud of her for being independent. But the truth is, I had spent my entire life understanding exactly how things work, especially in that company. And hearing that from her felt like something small inside me had been quietly pushed aside and left there. The change in her didn't come from nowhere. It came with him, it always did. He had a way of stepping into conversations without making it obvious, a way of guiding decisions, so that it felt like other people's ideas, even when they weren't. And over time I noticed she started repeating his words. His tone, even the way she looked at certain situations, shifted from empathy to calculation. Like she was learning to see the world the way he did, not as people, but as positions, as outcomes, as things to be managed and measured. And there was one evening that stayed with me more than the others. We were sitting at the dinner table, just the three of us, and the conversation drifted toward the company he was talking about. Expansion, new strategies, bigger risks, and she was nodding along, agreeing with everything he said, and when he finished, he turned to me with that same confident expression and asked, "What do you think?" And for a moment it felt like the old days. Like my opinion still carried weight. So I answered honestly. I told him the plan moved too fast, that it ignored the foundation the company was built on. That growth without control doesn't just create opportunity, it creates cracks that you don't see until it's too late. And he listened without interrupting, which at the time felt respectful. But then he smiled, not in agreement. Not in understanding, but in a way that made it clear he had already dismissed everything I said. And before I could add anything, my daughter spoke. She said, "We can't keep doing things the old way, Dad. This isn't your time anymore." And there it was, not loud, not angry, just simple and final, like a door closing quietly behind me. And I remember looking at her for a second longer than I should have, trying to find the girl who used to trust me completely, and instead I saw someone who had already chosen a side, and it wasn't mine. I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself. I just nodded and let the conversation move on, because something in me had already started to understand that this wasn't about a single decision or a single moment. This was a shift, and shifts like that don't reverse because of one conversation. They keep moving in the same direction until something forces them to stop, and at that point I still wasn't sure if I was going to be the one to stop it, or the one who would simply watch it go too far. And that night when I left their house, I didn't feel angry. I felt something worse. I felt replaced. Not in the company, not even in the family, but in the space I used to hold in her life. And once that space is gone, it doesn't come back easily. Especially when someone else is already standing in it, pretending it was always theirs. The decision didn't come with a storm. It came with a meeting invite sent late in the evening, with a subject line that looked routine, like something that would pass without notice. And by the time I walked into the conference room the next morning, everything had already been arranged. Seats filled, documents printed, a quiet sense of expectation hanging in the air, as if the outcome had been decided long before anyone spoke. And he was already there, standing near the head of the table, speaking in a low, confident tone to two board members who nodded as he talked, like they were listening to someone who belonged there, and not someone who had only been around for a few years. My daughter sat beside him, her posture straight, her expression calm, the way it gets when she thinks something important is about to happen. And when I took my seat, I noticed something small that most people wouldn't pay attention to. The folder placed in front of me was thinner than the others. Fewer pages, fewer details, like my role in that room had already been reduced before the meeting even started. He opened with a presentation. Clean numbers, steady growth projections that looked impressive on the surface. And I could see why it worked, because people don't question what looks successful. They follow it. And he knew that he walked them through each slide like he had been doing this his entire life. His voice measured his timing, precise, every answer ready before the question was even fully asked. And as I listened, I could also see what wasn't there, the risks hidden behind optimistic language, the assumptions that depended too heavily on things that couldn't be controlled, the kind of gaps that don't show up immediately, but grow over time until they become something you can't fix. And when he finished, there was a pause, not long, but just enough for someone to speak. And I felt the room shift slightly toward me like it used to. Like my words still had a place there, and I could have said something. I could have pointed out every flaw, every weak point, every reason why this plan would eventually break under its own weight, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned back slightly and folded my hands and let the silence stretch just a moment longer, before one of the board members cleared his throat and said, "It seems solid, And that was all it took, because once one person commits, the rest follow, and one by one they nodded, some more confidently than others. But none of them pushed back, not really. And then he spoke again, not to present, but to conclude. He said, for the company to move forward, we need clarity and leadership. We need someone who is fully aligned with the direction we're taking. And then he looked directly at me, not aggressive, not confrontational, just certain, and said, I believe it's time for a transition. And in that moment, the word transition carried more weight than anything else in the room. Because everyone understood what it meant, even if no one said it out loud. My daughter didn't look at me. She kept her eyes on the table, like she had already accepted it. Like this was something that needed to happen. And I could see how carefully it had all been planned. The timing, the language, the support, everything arranged in a way that made resistance look unreasonable and agreement feel inevitable. And again, I had a choice. I could have stopped it right there. I could have reminded them of things they had conveniently forgotten. I could have shifted the entire room with a few sentences if I wanted to, but instead I gave a small nod, the same kind I had given earlier, like I understood, like I agreed, and I watched as the decision moved forward without me becoming something official, something recorded, something that would later be referred to as a necessary step. And just like that, he took the chair, not by force, not by confrontation, but by creating a situation where everyone else believed it was the right thing to do. And as the meeting ended, and people began to stand and gather their papers, I remained seated for a second longer than the others. Not because I was surprised, but because I wanted to feel that moment clearly, the exact point where control shifted, not away from me, but into his hands. At least, that's what everyone in that room believed. And as I finally stood up, I looked at him once more, and he met my gaze with a slight smile, the kind that doesn't ask for approval because it already assumes it has it. And I returned the look without expression, without challenge, and without giving him anything he could read. Because the truth is, the chair he had just taken wasn't what he thought it was. And the power he believed he now held wasn't something that had ever truly left me in the first place. It started with small things, the kind you can explain away, if you want to believe nothing has really changed. My name stopped appearing on meeting agendas. Then the emails that used to include me as a default began to arrive without my address attached, like someone had simply forgotten. And maybe once or twice that would have been believable, but patterns have a way of revealing intent if you're willing to look closely enough. And I always was, the first time I tried to access one of the internal reports and saw the message saying my permissions had been restricted. I didn't call anyone to fix it. I didn't ask questions. I just read it again slowly, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something else, but they didn't. And for a brief moment, I imagined what it would look like from the outside, an old man who no longer needed access because he no longer had a role, and I could almost hear how easily that explanation would be accepted by everyone else in the building, because it made sense on the surface, and that's all most people ever look at. I walked through the office later that day, the same hallways I had walked 1,000 times before, and yet everything felt slightly different. Not in the way it looked, but in the way it responded to me. Conversations didn't stop completely when I passed, but they softened. People smiled. But it was the kind of smile you give out of politeness, not recognition. And there were a few who avoided eye contact altogether, as if acknowledging me might create a complication they didn't want to deal with. And I understood that too. Loyalty in a place like that doesn't belong to people. It belongs to power, and power had already shifted, at least in their eyes. Stepped into the break room at one point, and 2 junior employees were talking quietly until they noticed me. Then one of them straightened up and said, "Good morning, sir," with just enough hesitation to show he wasn't sure if that was still the right thing to say, and I nodded back without correcting him. Because I wasn't interested in forcing respect from people who no longer felt it naturally. And as I poured myself a cup of coffee, I listened to the way they resumed their conversation. Once they thought I wasn't paying attention, they talked about upcoming changes, new leadership, new direction, new opportunities. And the way they said it made it clear that whatever came next didn't include me, not really. And I found that I wasn't angry about it. Not in the way someone might expect. I wasn't shocked either, because everything I was seeing had already been set in motion long before it became visible. What I felt instead was a kind of clarity, the kind that comes when a situation finally reveals itself completely without pretending to be something else. And clarity has a way of removing hesitation, because once you see things as they are, you no longer waste time hoping they'll turn back into what they used to be. I returned to my office after that, a space that had once been central to every major decision in the company, and now felt more like a place that hadn't been updated in years. Not because it was outdated, but because it had been left behind. And as I sat there, I noticed something else. The phone hadn't rung once that morning. Not a single call, not a single interruption. And that silence said more than anything else could, because it meant no one needed me, or at least no one believed they did. And I leaned back in my chair and let that settle for a moment. Not as a loss, but as confirmation that everything had moved exactly where it was supposed to go, for him to feel confident enough, for him to believe there were no obstacles left. No one who could challenge him. No one who even wanted to. And that belief was important, because people only overstep when they're sure there's nothing left to stop them. And by the time he stood in front of me and told me I didn't belong there anymore, that belief had already taken root so deeply that he didn't even question it, not once. And that was why I didn't correct anything, I didn't push back when my access was removed. I didn't reinsert myself into meetings, I didn't remind anyone of what I still held. Because the more invisible I became, the more comfortable he grew, and the more comfortable he grew, the further he would go, and I needed him to go far enough that there would be no way for him to step back when the truth finally surfaced. They invited me over on a Sunday evening, not with urgency, not with warmth, just a simple message that said, "Come by, we should have dinner." And I could already tell from the way it was written that this wasn't about spending time together. It was about something else, something that needed to be said in a setting that looked casual enough to hide it. And when I arrived, the house was quiet in that controlled way, where everything is already prepared. Before the guest steps in, the table was set, the food arranged neatly. My daughter greeted me with a brief smile, not cold, not warm, just distant. And he was already seated scrolling through something on his phone before putting it down as I walked in and giving me that same polite nod he had mastered over time, the kind that acknowledges your presence without giving it weight. We sat down, and for a few, needed minutes, the conversation stayed on safe ground. Small things, work, weather, routine topics that don't lead anywhere, and I let it continue because I knew it wouldn't last. Moments like that never do, not when there's something underneath waiting to surface. And it didn't take long before he shifted the direction. He leaned back slightly, glanced at my daughter and then at me and said, "We've been thinking about making some structural changes at the company, nothing too drastic, just adjustments to align things better with where we're heading." And the way he said we made it sound like I was included in that decision. Even though everything about the situation made it clear I wasn't my daughter. Nodded immediately, adding that it was necessary, that the company had grown beyond its original model and needed to adapt to stay competitive, and I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to hear how far they were willing to take it when they believed I had no say left. He continued outlining ideas, new departments, new leadership layers, more centralized control, everything presented as improvement, everything framed as progress. And then he paused just long enough to look at me, as if inviting input. Though the decision had already been made, and I could have challenged it, I could have pointed out the risks, the way centralizing too much power creates blind spots, the way rapid changes without grounding destabilize what took years to build. But instead, I simply asked one question. I said, "And where do you see me in all of this?" And for the first time that evening, there was a slight shift, not in his confidence, but in the way my daughter looked down at her plate before answering. Said, "Maybe it's time you rest more. Dad, you've done enough. You don't need to be involved in everything anymore." And the words were gentle on the surface, but the meaning was clear. I was being moved out, not gradually, not respectfully, but completely. And he followed it with something even simpler. He said the company needs people who can keep up with the pace, and the implication didn't need to be explained. It hung there between us, heavier than anything else that had been said. And I let the silence sit for a moment, before nodding once again, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Because by then I wasn't surprised by any of it. Not the plan, not the tone, not even the fact that my daughter was the one helping him say it. And as the dinner continued, the conversation drifted back to safer topics, as if what had just happened could be folded away and forgotten, but it couldn't, because moments like that don't disappear. They settle somewhere deep and stay there. And when I left that night, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel hurt in the way I might have years ago. What I felt was certainty. Certainty that whatever line had existed between us had already been crossed, and there was no intention of stepping back from it. And that made everything simpler, because once you understand that, you stop waiting for things to change and start preparing for what comes next. And as I drove home, the city lights passing by without meaning, I realized something else. They weren't just pushing me out of the company. They were erasing me from the story entirely. And the more they believed they had already done it, the easier it would be for them to take the final step without hesitation, without doubt, without ever asking themselves if they had made a mistake. It showed up in the numbers before it showed up anywhere else. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a shift in how things were being reported. Small adjustments in projections, a little too optimistic, a little too clean, the kind of reports that look impressive in a meeting, but don't quite match what you feel when you've spent enough years inside a business to recognize its rhythm. And I had spent more than enough years. I sat at my desk, going through one of the quarterly summaries that I wasn't supposed to have access to anymore. Someone had forwarded it quietly, no name attached, no message, just the file itself. And as I read through it, I could see exactly what he was doing. Expanding too quickly, reallocating funds based on assumptions that hadn't been tested. Pushing growth in areas that required stability first, and each decision on its own could be explained, justified, even, but together they formed a pattern, a direction that would hold for a while and then collapse under its own weight. And I leaned back and let that realization settle, not with urgency, not with panic, but with a kind of calm that comes when you understand something completely. And I knew I had a choice in that moment. I could step in, correct the course, slow everything down before it went too far. I still had the authority to do it, whether anyone realized it or not. But instead, I closed the file and set it aside. Because this wasn't a mistake I needed to fix, it was a path he had chosen. And sometimes the only way for someone to understand the consequences of a path is to walk far enough down it that turning back becomes impossible. Later that afternoon, I passed by one of the conference rooms and saw him inside with a group of managers speaking with that same steady confidence, outlining the next phase of expansion, and the way they listened to him, the way they nodded. It reminded me of something I had seen many times before. People don't follow truth, they follow certainty, and he had learned how to project it perfectly, even when the foundation underneath it wasn't as solid as it appeared. And for a moment I wondered if he truly believed in what he was saying, or if he had simply convinced himself that believing was enough to make it real, because there's a difference between confidence and control, and most people don't recognize it until they lose one of them. I kept walking without interrupting, without making my presence known, because by then my role wasn't to guide or correct. It was to observe, to let everything unfold exactly as it would if I wasn't there at all, and that meant allowing the first crack to widen just enough that it couldn't be ignored. Later that evening, I received a call from one of the older board members, a man who had been with the company long before my son-in-law ever set foot in it. His voice was careful, not urgent, but not relaxed either. He asked if I had seen the latest reports, and I told him I had. He paused for a second before saying, "Do you think it's sustainable?" And I could hear what he wasn't saying. The concern beneath the question, the uncertainty he wasn't ready to voice openly yet. And I answered him in the simplest way possible. I said, "It will hold for a while." And that was enough, because he understood exactly what that meant. We ended the call shortly after, and I sat there for a moment longer looking at the phone before setting it down, because even though some people were starting to notice, they weren't ready to act, and until they were, nothing would change. And that was fine, because change was coming whether they initiated it or not, and the longer things continued the way they were, the clearer the outcome would become, not just for him, but for everyone involved. And when that moment arrived, when the gap between what he believed and what was actually happening became too large to ignore, there would be no room left for explanation, no space to shift blame, no way to quietly adjust course. And that was when I would step back in, not to argue, not to prove anything, but simply to remind them of something they had all chosen to forget, that the company they were trying to reshape had never truly been theirs to control in the first place. It was late in the afternoon, when the floor had thinned out, and the energy of the day had settled into that quiet hum that comes before people start leaving, and I wasn't planning to stay. But as I passed by the smaller conference room near the back corridor, I heard my name, not loud, not urgent, just spoken in that controlled tone people use when they think they won't be overheard, and I stopped, not abruptly, just enough to listen without making it obvious. And through the glass, I could see him at the head of the table, with 3 managers seated across from him, the door slightly ajar, just enough for their voices to carry. And he was outlining something that sounded familiar at first, restructuring timelines, reallocating responsibilities. But then the direction shifted. He said, "We need to finalize the transition completely, no gray areas, no informal roles lingering in the background." And one of the managers asked, "What about him?" Not using my name, as if that alone made it easier, and my son-in-law didn't hesitate. He said he won't be part of this moving forward. "We'll keep things respectful but clear. He's no longer involved in operations." And the way he said respectful made it sound like a formality, not a value, like something to be checked off, rather than upheld. And another voice spoke up, asking if there would be any complications, any resistance. And he gave a small dismissive shake of his head. He said there won't be. He's already stepped back. He knows where things are heading, and in that moment I realized something important. It wasn't just that he believed I had no power left. It was that he believed I had accepted it, that I had quietly agreed to be removed. And that belief had removed the last hesitation he might have had, because people only move this confidently when they're certain there will be no consequences. I stayed there just long enough to hear the rest. Timelines dates a plan to formalize everything within days, not weeks, and then I moved on without letting them see me. Not because I was avoiding the situation, but because I had already learned everything I needed to know. Confrontation at that point would have changed nothing. It would have only made them more careful, more cautious, and I needed the opposite. I needed them to continue exactly as they were, without doubt, without restraint, because the further they went, the clearer everything would become. Later that evening, I sat alone in my office, the lights dimmed, the building nearly empty, and for the first time since all of this began, I took out the documents I had kept, untouched for years. Not because I had forgotten them, but because I had never needed them before. Papers that outlined ownership structures, decisions made long ago, agreements that had been put in place quietly, without announcement, without attention, because at the time there was no reason to make them visible. Everything had been built on trust back then, and trust doesn't need to be documented loudly, but time has a way of changing what trust means. And as I reviewed each page carefully, not rushing, not hesitating, I could see how everything connected, how every assumption they had made about control, about authority, about who truly held what had been built on something incomplete, something they had never bothered to question. And I placed the documents back into their folder and closed it slowly, because there was no urgency in what I was doing, not. Yet everything was already in motion. Everything was moving toward a point where it would have to resolve one way or another, and I knew exactly when that moment would come. Not because I had planned it, but because they had, by pushing things forward faster than they understood, by removing me more completely than they needed to, by convincing themselves that there was nothing left to uncover. And as I stood up and turned off the light, I realized that what was coming next wouldn't require me to fight for anything. It would simply require me to show up at the right time and let the truth speak for itself. The message went out just after 8. A brief internal announcement written in clean professional language that said there would be a company-wide meeting at 10 to clarify leadership structure and future direction. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would raise questions if you didn't already know what it meant. But by the time I read it, I already understood exactly what they were about to do. This wasn't just another step. This was the moment they planned to make everything permanent, to turn assumptions into policy, to turn belief into record. And once something is recorded, people stop questioning it. They accept it as fact and move on. I arrived earlier than usual, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see how the building felt on a day like that. And there was a subtle difference in the air conversations, a little sharper movements, a little quicker, the kind of energy that comes when people know something is about to change, even if they don't fully understand what it is yet. And as I walked through the lobby, a few heads turned, not out of recognition, but out of curiosity. Like I was someone they weren't sure how to place anymore. And I continued on without acknowledging it, because by then, none of that mattered. Not the looks, not the silence, not even the outcome they believed was about to happen. When the meeting began, the main conference room was full, every seat taken, managers lined along the walls, a few late arrivals standing near the back, and he stood at the front, composed, confident, already in control of the room before he even spoke. My daughter beside him again. Her presence steady, her expression unreadable, like she had rehearsed this moment in her mind enough times that it no longer felt uncertain. He started with numbers, growth, performance, projections, the same foundation he always used because it made everything else easier to accept. And then he transitioned smoothly into structure. He spoke about alignment, clarity, the need for decisive leadership. And as he moved through it, I could see the room following him, not questioning, not resisting, just accepting, because that's what people do when something is presented with enough certainty. And then he reached the point I had been waiting for. He said, "Moving forward, the company will operate under a unified leadership model with clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and there will be no informal authority outside of that structure." And the words landed exactly the way he intended them, to formal, final, leaving no space for interpretation, and he paused just long enough to let it settle before continuing. And as part of this transition, individuals who are no longer directly involved in operations will step away from active roles and focus on personal priorities. He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. The entire room understood. And for a brief moment, there was a shift in the atmosphere. A quiet recognition that something had just been closed off completely, and I stood there listening to it all unfold, without interruption, without reaction, because this was the version of the story they had chosen. The one where I had already faded out, the one where my presence was no longer necessary, and once he finished, there was a small round of applause, not loud, not enthusiastic, just enough to signal agreement. Enough to make it real, and as people began to settle back into their seats, he looked directly at me for the first time. That morning, not with uncertainty, not with hesitation, but with the same calm certainty he had shown from the beginning. And that was when he said it again. Not as a question, not as a suggestion, but as a conclusion. You don't belong here anymore. And this time there was no quiet conversation around it. No softened tone, no attempt to disguise what it meant. It was clear, direct, final, and I held his gaze for a moment longer than he expected. Not to challenge him, not to correct him, but to let him feel the weight of what he had just said without understanding it, and then just like before. I gave a small nod, turned, and began walking toward the door, leaving behind a room full of people who believed they had just witnessed the end of something, when in reality, they had only just reached the point where everything was about to begin. I didn't rush home after I walked out of that room. I took the long way through the city, letting the noise settle around me, because everything that needed to happen next required patience, not reaction. And by the time I reached my place, the phone rang before I even had a chance to take off my coat. The number wasn't saved, but I recognized it immediately. It was the same board member who had called me days earlier. His voice this time was different, less careful, more direct. He didn't ask if I had seen what happened. He said we need to talk, and I told him to come by within the hour. He arrived exactly when he said he would. Not a minute early, not a minute late, the way people do when they know the conversation matters. And as he stepped inside, he didn't sit right away. He looked at me for a second, as if trying to measure something before finally taking the chair across from me and saying, "I think things have gone too far." And I let that sit for a moment before answering. I said they've gone exactly as far as they were allowed to go, and he exhaled slowly, not in disagreement, but in realization. Because deep down he already knew that none of this had happened by accident. It had been built step by step, decision by decision, until it reached a point where it looked irreversible. At least from the outside, he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, even though there was no one else in the room, and asked, "Do you still have control?" And that question. Right, there was the first honest one anyone had asked me since all of this began. Not because of what it said, but because of what it assumed, that control isn't always visible. That power doesn't disappear just because people stop acknowledging it, and she looked at him steadily before replying, "I never gave it away." And for the first time since he walked in, I saw something shift in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of clarity settling into place, like pieces of a puzzle finally aligning. He asked then, why let it get this far? And I answered him in the same calm tone I had carried through everything else I said. Because I needed to see who they would become when they thought nothing could stop them, and we both knew who I meant without saying their names. He nodded slowly, then asked what happens next. And I stood up, walking over to the cabinet where I had kept the documents for years, untouched. Not forgotten, just waiting. And I placed the folder on the table between us, opening it just enough for him to see the first page. Not all of it, just enough to understand what it was. Agreements, signatures, structures that had never been replaced, never transferred, never dissolved. And as his eyes moved across the page, I could see the realization deepen, not just that I still had control, but that legally, structurally, undeniably, the company had never stopped being mine. Not in the way that mattered. And he leaned back in his chair, letting out a quiet breath before saying, "They don't know, do they?" And I closed the folder calmly and replied, "No, they don't." And for a moment, neither of us spoke. Because the weight of that truth didn't need to be explained. It was already clear what it meant for everything that had just happened, for every decision, every announcement, every word spoken with certainty that morning. And finally he asked when, and I didn't hesitate. I said, "Tomorrow morning, call a full board meeting, make it mandatory, no delays, no excuses." And he nodded once more. Already understanding the role he would play and what was coming next as he stood to leave. He paused at the door and said, "This will end badly for them. And I met his gaze without emotion and answered, that depends on what they do when they finally understand. And after he left, I remained where I was for a few seconds longer, looking at the closed folder on the table before picking it up and placing it back exactly where it had been, because there was no need to keep it out. No need to rush anything anymore. Everything was already set. The only thing left now was for them to walk into a room tomorrow morning, believing they were still in control, and watch what happens when that belief is taken away from them all at once. The boardroom felt different the moment I stepped in. Not because anything had physically changed, but because the balance in that room had already begun to shift. Even if no one else realized it, yet the chairs were filled earlier than usual, conversations quieter, more contained, the kind that stop just short of saying what everyone is thinking. And at the far end of the table he stood again, confident, composed, exactly the same man who had stood in front of the entire company the day before and told me I didn't belong there anymore. My daughter was beside him as always, her posture straight, her expression calm, but there was something new in the way she avoided looking at me. Not distance, not indifference. Something closer to unease, like a thought she hadn't fully formed yet. And as I took my seat, no one questioned it, not directly, but I could feel the hesitation ripple through the room, the silent calculation of whether I should even be there. And that hesitation was all I needed, because it meant doubt had already started to surface before a single word had been spoken. The chairman called the meeting to order, his tone formal, his eyes moving briefly toward me before returning to the table as if acknowledging something he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. And then he invited my son-in-law to begin, and he did exactly what he always did. He spoke with certainty, outlining the next phase, reinforcing the decisions made the day before, presenting everything as if it had already been accepted, finalized beyond reconsideration. And as he talked, I watched the room, not him, because I already knew what he would say. I watched the way a few of the board members exchanged brief glances, the way one of them tapped his pen against the table just slightly out of rhythm, the way my daughter's hands remained folded a little tighter than usual, and when he finished, he looked around, expecting agreement, expecting the same quiet nods that had carried him this far, and for a moment, that's exactly what he got. Silence, not resistance, not support, just a pause that stretched longer than it should have. And then the chairman cleared his throat and said, "Before we move forward, there is a matter that needs clarification," and the words landed with more weight than anything else that had been said so far, because they introduced something he hadn't planned for something he couldn't control. And I saw the first flicker of confusion pass through his expression. Not fear, not yet. Just a brief interruption in the certainty he relied on. And the chairman continued, his voice steady but more deliberate. "Now, regarding ownership structure and ultimate authority over this company, there have been assumptions made that require correction. And that was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the room to lean forward collectively, as if pulled by something they didn't fully understand yet. And I remained still, letting the silence build, letting the words settle, because timing matters more than volume in moments like that. And when the chairman finally turned his attention fully toward me and said, "Would you like to address this?" The room followed his gaze, every eye moving in the same direction. The same man they had watched walk out the day before, now sitting quietly at the table as if he had never left. And I stood slowly, not with urgency, not with hesitation, just enough to make it clear that I had always belonged in that space, whether they recognized it or not. And I looked at him first. Not the room, not the board, just him, because this moment was his, as much as it was mine. And I said in the same calm tone he had used before, "You were right about one thing yesterday. I didn't belong there anymore." And for a second, I saw relief flash across his face, like he thought this was confirmation, like everything was about to be resolved in his favor. And then I continued, "But not for the reason you believed." And that relief disappeared just as quickly as it had come, replaced by something sharper, something closer to uncertainty. And I let that sit before taking the folder from the table and opening it just enough for the first page to be visible, not rushing, not explaining, simply placing it where everyone could see. And as the chairman leaned, shucked forward, and the others followed, I spoke again. This company was never transferred, never divided, never placed under any structure that removed my authority, and every agreement signed, every role assigned, every decision made since then has existed under that fact, whether it was acknowledged or not. And the room didn't react immediately, not with noise, not with interruption, just with stillness, the kind that comes when something is understood all at once but hasn't been processed yet. And I turned the page slowly, allowing the details to speak for themselves. Signatures, dates, legal confirmations, things that don't change just because people choose to ignore them. And when I looked back up, I saw it clearly, the shift not just in him, but in everyone, the realization that everything they had assumed, everything they had accepted as fact, had been built on something incomplete. And I closed the folder gently, placing my hand on it, not as a gesture of control, but as a simple acknowledgement of what it represented. And I finished in the same tone I had used from the beginning. Nothing raised, nothing forced, just clear from this point forward. There will be no confusion about who this company belongs to. And this time, there was no silence that followed, no hesitation, no space left for interpretation. Because the truth once spoken like that doesn't need to be repeated. It settles into the room and changes everything, whether people are ready for it or not. No one spoke for a few seconds after that, not because they didn't have anything to say, but because they didn't yet know how to say it without exposing how completely they had misjudged the situation. The chairman was the first to move. He straightened the papers in front of him, more out of habit than necessity, and then said, "We will need to formally review and correct the leadership structure effective immediately." And his tone had changed. Not louder, not harsher, just aligned now with something real instead of something assumed. And I watched as that single sentence began to reshape the room board members who had been silent the day before. Now leaned forward, asking precise questions, timelines, authority reversals, legal confirmations, all the things that should have been asked earlier but weren't because certainty had replaced caution. And at the far end of the table, my son-in-law hadn't moved at all. Not yet, his hands still resting on the edge of the table, his posture unchanged, as if he believed that staying still might hold everything in place, but it didn't. Because the moment had already passed him, the certainty he relied on had fractured, and without it, everything else started to slip. The chairman turned to him, finally, not with accusation, but with clarity, and said, "Your position as CEO is under review, pending immediate evaluation of your decisions and conduct." And that was the closest thing to removal anyone in that room needed to hear, because titles don't disappear all at once. They unravel, and once that process starts, it doesn't stop until there's nothing left to hold on to. My daughter shifted beside him, then for the first time since the meeting began, her composure breaking, just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice maybe, but enough for me. She looked at him, not at me, searching for something, reassurance, explanation, anything that could make sense of what was happening, and he didn't give it to her because he didn't have it anymore. Everything he had built, his confidence, his control, his place in that room, had depended on something that no longer existed, and without it, there was nothing left to stand on. The questions continued around the table. Decisions began to take shape. Actions were outlined not with hesitation, but with purpose, because once people understand the truth, they move quickly to align themselves with it. And I remained where I was listening, not directing, not interfering. Because there was no need to, the structure was correcting itself the way it always does when the foundation is finally seen for what it is. And when the meeting concluded, there was no applause, no formal closing statement, just a quiet understanding that everything had changed. And as people began to stand and gather their things, a few of them looked at me differently, Not with the casual politeness from before, but with recognition, something closer to what used to be there years ago. And I acknowledged it with the same small nod I had given before, because respect that returns after being withdrawn isn't something you chase. It's something you observe. My son-in-law stood last, slower than the others, as if the act of moving required more effort now. And when he finally looked at me, there was no confidence left in his expression, no certainty, no assumption, just a question he hadn't found the words for. And I held his gaze for a moment, not to confront him, not to humiliate him, but to let him understand that this wasn't sudden, this wasn't unexpected. This was the result of everything he had chosen to do when he believed there would be no consequences. And then I turned away, because there was nothing else that needed to be said. Not in that room, not in that moment. Some things don't require words once the truth has already done the work for you. And as I walked out of the boardroom, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not victory, not satisfaction, something quieter, something steadier. A sense that the weight I had been carrying had finally shifted. Not because I had taken anything back, but because everything had returned to where it had always been. And outside in the hallway, the building moved as it always does, people walking, talking, continuing their day as if nothing had happened. And maybe to them it hadn't, but for me, and for the people in that room, everything had changed. And what came next wouldn't be about proving anything. It would be about deciding what to do with what remained and who still had a place in it. And that decision, unlike all the others, would not be made in silence.